smells delicious. And a lot of good food in there. We're going to be going over and talking about the various missions that we support, and we'd love for you to join us for that. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open to Exodus, the 13th chapter, verse 17. We're going to pick up there in just a little bit and work our way through this amazing story that serves as one of the foundational stories of our faith and our practice. For many people, today's story, the crossing of the Red Sea, is the continuation of last week's story about God using his mighty powers to set Israel free from slavery in Egypt. The story of the crossing of the Red Sea begins, as I just said, in the 17th verse of the 13th chapter. So at the beginning of the 13th chapter, those first 16 verses are really not a part of the story that we're looking at today. But knowing what is said in those verses will help you understand how God planned for the sacrifices that would be made during their Passover festival to remember their Exodus, whenever Israel would finally be in the Promised Land, to prepare his people to accept his son Jesus as the Messiah. The first part of chapter 13 recounts how God put the focus of their annual Passover festival on that very last plague, on the death of the firstborn male, which brought Pharaoh to his knees. You know, it was his son that died, and it broke him, and he submitted, not because he wanted to follow God, but because he just couldn't take it anymore. As the observance of this Passover festival was handed down from generation to generation, they would remember that the Israelites' own firstborn sons would also have died had they not followed God's direction to kill a lamb and to place its blood on the doorpost of their homes. So each year when they would have this celebration as a part of their observance, they would first of all acknowledge that their own firstborn males belonged to the Lord. Now, to me, I want to hear that in a positive way. Like they belong to the Lord to serve him, or they belong to the Lord to go. But they would really belong to the Lord to do with what the Lord wanted to do, even if that meant kill them. What would you do to redeem your son if he was in the hands of God and he was going to die? Or would you say, you know, God's not really serious about that? Would you be like the Egyptians at first? They heard, you know, God said, hey, we're going to kill the firstborn son. They're like, we're not worried about it. We're not worried about what God's going to do. We're just going to keep doing what we want to do. Or would you say, you know, I don't know if God was really serious about this obedience, killing a lamb thing and putting the door. That just seems so weird. I mean, how is that going to make any difference whatsoever? What would you rather see die? Your son? Or some innocent lamb? You know, like he did for Abraham, the Lord would provide the lamb. At the Passover, the lamb would be used, of course, to feed the family. It became a part of their feast that night, and the blood was used to redeem the son. They would, as a part of this annual observance, year after year after year, acknowledge that the lamb that had been slain was done so their firstborns could be redeemed. That's a message that was at the heart of their society. It would prepare them to one day accept God's Son, the Lamb of God, who would come to take away the sins of the world, that he would become the sacrifice, his blood would be put on the post, and redemption would be not just for the firstborn male, but for all who put their faith and trust in God. But before that could happen, the rest of the story has to take place. Before they could hand this down from generation to generation, those that were out in the wilderness following Moses out of Egypt would finally have to get away from Pharaoh once and for all. So we're going to work through this story. I'm going to read just a little bit of it at a time, and I'll stop and I'll make an observation or two, and then keep reading. I'm not going to point out all of the lessons to be learned in this story, but just enough stories for you to look at what God might be revealing you in these words, because he's going to speak to you through it. He always speaks to his people through his word. So starting in verse 17. Now, when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though that was near. For God said, the people might change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Just a reminder, the promised land was an occupied land. Not only the Philistines, but the Amorites, the Amalekites, and there were just all kinds of kites that were there. There were lots of people that were in it. And those that occupied the promised land were fierce fighters. And they would not want to just give up their land. They were going to fight for it. And Israel, if they just got led straight to the promised land, they would have looked at that and they're like, I don't think it's worth it. I think we were better off in Egypt. It would just be an impossible task. It would cost too many lives. Why would you go that way? And God knew that Israel would rather return to slavery than to fight for their freedom. So he doesn't lead them there directly. He wanted to show them that he would be doing the fighting for them. And they weren't ready to do that yet. And so he was going to teach them that he would fight for them. Verse 18. Hence God led the people around by the way of the wilderness, not the shortcut to the up there, but over toward the Red Sea. And the sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt. In other words, God led them in a totally different direction from the promised land because they weren't ready to get there yet. And while they looked like an army on the move, they were in this martial array, they also sort of looked lost. They looked like they didn't know where they were going. They looked like they might be easy prey. We should certainly be able to relate to that. For there are times when it seems like God is leading us in the opposite direction of where we're supposed to go or where we want to go. But like Israel did, whenever it's God who's leading, it's best for us to follow. He may have some lessons for us to learn so that we'll be ready to get to that place that we want to be. Verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones from here with you. There's something for which Israel is to be commended. They had remembered, after some over 400 years, a promise that had been made to Joseph. I found it interesting that the first part of the promise was, God will surely take care of you. Joseph was really a man of faith. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, he just knew that God would. God's going to take care of you. And when God takes care of you and he leads you from here, I want you to take my bones with you. That is going to happen. Those are words of faith. And they remembered those words and they kept their sign of it. And in fact, that's what God is doing right now in this story. He's taking care of them with Moses and Aaron at the right time, in the right way, to get them to the right place. Verse 20. Then they set out from Succoth, and they camped in Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Now, I don't know about you, but it does sort of sound cool that God was leading them in this very visible way. There's a part of me that goes, I wish you would do that today. I wish I could just look out there and go there's the cloud. That's where we're going. Follow the cloud. I mean, wouldn't it be great? Because sometimes we're going okay, God, I don't know where the next step is. I'm trying to figure out what your will is and what I'm supposed to do, and I'm looking around. I'm wanting to see the fire cloud thing or something. Just show me where I'm supposed to be. Don't you have those prayers sometimes? And here they have this benefit of unmistakable leading from God. Just look and follow me. But the part about this I don't like is the day and the night thing. When I read this, I go that sounds exhausting. You're leading them day and night. When do they get a break? You're constantly leading them. You're always going them every moment, every day, every night. He's leading us. And we're to be following. In other words, there's no break. There's no vacation. There's no escape. If you're following, He's leading. And He's always going to be there. Not is He only going to show you the way, but He is going to protect you along the way. Start of this next chapter, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before, here's one of those words that no one pronounces right, Pihahiroth, between Migdal and the sea. You shall camp in front of Baal Zephron, opposite by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, or say of the sons of Israel, they're wandering around aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Have you ever gone fishing with artificial lures? You know, gone out there and you're at the lake, and you know the fish are in there, but and you're trying to figure out how you can get them to strike. You know, it might be the kind of lure you use, it might be the color of the lure you use, it might be something like that. But fish strike for different reasons. Sometimes they strike because they're hungry, but sometimes, man, they're protecting their nests. The first time I heard that, it kind of made me sad. You mean I'm going over where their nest is, and the reason they're striking is because they're trying to protect their nest? Some fish do that. Some strike at the thing going by because they're annoyed with it. Sometimes they're being territorial. And God was, in a way, fishing for Pharaoh. He knew exactly what would make him strike. And the purpose was to teach Pharaoh that he really was the Lord of all. Now, that was the lesson that he'd been teaching him all along, through every plague. I want you to understand, I am the Lord of all, I am the Lord of all, I am the Lord of all. He chips away and chips away and chips away, but he never really gets that lesson. Even after the death of his firstborn son, he doesn't get the lesson. He doesn't understand that he is the Lord of all. God was, in a sense, tempting Pharaoh. But hardening his heart did not make Pharaoh do something that he didn't want to do. It just gave him the resolve that he needed. God was helping him to reveal his true cause. God knows what is really going on inside of your heart and inside of your mind. Now, Satan will deceive you and get you to do something that you don't really want to do. But God gives us the opportunity to reveal what's going on inside of us. He gives us the opportunity to be tested to show ourselves faithful, or depending on what's inside, to show ourselves unfaithful. Remember the time that we studied not too long ago when Satan asked if he could sift Peter like wheat to reveal what was in there? Or we like going back to the story of Job, don't we? And where Satan again gets permission to test him. He says, the only reason he's following you is because everything's perfect in his life. Man, if I take away all that stuff, he'll turn away from you. And God said, give it your best shot. I know what's in his heart. Test away. If Satan is doing it, we call it temptation. But if God is doing it, we call it testing. And just some FYI, in the original languages, there's only one word that gets translated either testing or tempting, depending on who is doing it in the situation that is taking place. So whether you're being tempted or tested might not only be dependent on whether it's Satan or God, but it might really be dependent on what's in your heart, what's being revealed. Verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people, and they said, what is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made his chariot ready and took his people with him. He took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. Now, we're not told how the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, only that he did. And as we learn, as we did in the last story last week, Pharaoh did not really believe that God was the Lord of all. He still didn't accept that. If he had really believed that God was the Lord of all, he would have stayed put. He said, no, I learned my lesson. Enough is enough. I'm not going to go after him. My firstborn was plenty. I'm not going to go chasing after this God who could do even more. He would not have opposed letting them really go. But he didn't believe that. He had not, even after that dead son, learned that lesson that God is the Lord of all. I hope that you can learn that lesson and that you learn it quickly. Number 8. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he chased after the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out boldly. That last word of verse 8 is interesting to me. It's been a long time since I read it too, and I wasn't really expecting it to show up at the end of that sentence. It means that Pharaoh had gotten the wrong idea about what was happening. Israel was not out there wandering around aimlessly at all. They were instead being very intentional. They were boldly following God. That's how our following of Jesus should be described. We should be boldly following him. But from the perspective of someone who doesn't believe that God is the Lord, our boldness of just, okay, here's God, I'm following behind him, they may look at our lives and saying, they seem to be going erratic. They seem to be lost. They look like an opportunity where we can ensnare them and capture them. But God knows what he's doing when he's leading us, and he will probably teach those who are opposed to us that hard lesson that he really is the Lord. Verse 9. Then the Egyptians chased after them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army. They overtook them, being the Israelites, camping by the sea. The reason they overtook them is because God had led them there and just said, stay still. Besides Pihahiroth, in front of Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Their boldness turned into fearfulness in an instant. Remember that this is a great picture. God is saying, I'm finally getting them to come out here. This is exactly what I want. And here is Israel. And they're not seeing things that way. You know, things look quite different when everything is going well, and things look like trouble when they're about to get messy. Instead of seeing God's protection, they took their eyes off of him, and all they saw was the threat of Pharaoh. When the enemy approaches, it's better to keep your eyes on Jesus. See his protection, see his care, see his leading, rather than taking your eyes off of him and seeing the danger and the peril and the problems. Verse 11. Then they said to Moses, it is because there were no... Sorry, I always get this wrong. Then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt and saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. It would not have been better for them to remain in slavery. It would not have been better for them to go back to Egypt. But whenever our fear of death comes into play, our trust in God often falters. You know, Jesus said, and he said this numerous times when you read the Gospels, that we are to fear God more than we fear anything else, even death. Verse 13. But Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you this day. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. It doesn't seem to me at this point in the story that Moses had any idea what the Lord was going to do next. But he was fully confident that whatever he was going to do, it was going to deliver him. He was sure of that. And while he was encouraging the people of that very thing and that they should be trusting God, he also, in some way that's not mentioned in the story, was himself crying out to the Lord. You know how people can do that. They can be giving you the right words, but secretly inside they're going like, man, we are in so much trouble. Something like that must have been going on, because we get these words in verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Not all of Israel. Why are you, Moses, crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. As for you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. Now, the little experiment over here, he got the different colors to separate, but there was still water, that alcohol in the middle. There was no dryness on the plate. You couldn't see that. I just thought I'd throw it out there. There's something unique about this miracle. I don't know how long it takes for a lake bed to dry up, but instant is not it. I know that much. Overnight is not it. I think God was reminding Moses that yes, the way that he was leading them looked like a dead end. The way I'm leading you, your way of escape, looks like there is no escape. But you need to keep your eyes on me, and you need to quit being a backseat driver. How many of you are secretly backseat drivers? Anyone in here? It's one of those things, we don't admit that in public, right? No way are we going to admit that we're a backseat driver. We might be that front seat driver that keeps silent, but our foot is on the floor, passing the brake pedal, right? Yeah, or the gas, whatever it might be. Or you might be trying to just go around that person. We want to tell God what to do. Hey, God. And he's like, no, I've got a job for you. This is your job. You're supposed to get the sons of Israel going toward the sea. That's your job. I know it looks like you're not going anywhere, but that's your job. You get them. This is the direction you're going. Go that way. You're to stretch out your hands over it, and I'm going to provide them. There's an obedience faith. Why would Moses have to lift out his hands and hold over it? I mean, it's like Moses got power. No. The only thing that happens when Moses lifts his hands is I'm being obedient to the Lord. God told me to lift them up, so here they go. I'm trusting you, God, to make me look good. Your power is what's going to take place here. Sometimes God asks us to be obedient, and what he asks us to do is like, God, what you're asking me to do doesn't seem like it's going to make any difference whatsoever. But you asked me to do it, so I'm just going to do it trusting that you're going to keep your promises. God would provide a way. God said, you do that, and I've got my own work to do on this day. Verse 17. As for me, behold, I will harden the heart of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all of his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. See, here's the point again. I want these Egyptians to understand that I am the Lord of all when I am honored through Pharaoh, through his chariots, and through his horsemen. In other words, here's the might of Egypt. And they're not willing to learn the lesson. They're not willing to cut their losses. They still think that they're mightier than I am. And I am going to be glorified through their lives. God has given them that opportunity, and they're taking it. That's when God started making things happen by providing not only the way of escape for Israel, but essentially a trap for Egypt. 19, the angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel, that cloud, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, so that it became between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. There was the cloud along with darkness, and it gave light at night. Thus one did not come near the other all night. So Egypt shows up, Israel's over here, they're separated by this big cloud thing. I don't know about you, but this is where I'm starting to have questions about Egypt and Pharaoh's wisdom. I mean, if you saw this big cloud thing and it blew at night, would you say, yeah, man, we're going right into this thing? I think might be, especially after all of the plagues. You would think that this is the time he would start to say, maybe this isn't such a good idea. But he had no fear of God. He had no understanding that God really is the Lord. And so when he saw this, he probably just thought it was a haboob. He just thought that it was just this natural phenomenon. If I just wait long enough, it's going to blow away, and I'll be able to do what I want to do. I mean, albeit it's a haboob that glows at night. Instead of recognizing God's hand, he just sees some natural obstacle to overcome. Verse 21. Then Moses stretches out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on dry land. Keeps emphasizing that. And the waters were like a wall to them on the right and on their left. I think unlike the Egyptians, the Israelites realized that this wasn't just some quirk of nature. I think they realize that God is doing the impossible. He's providing for us a way of escape to get to a new land and to have a new life. I think that's why the Apostle Paul would connect their passing through the Red Sea, passing through the waters. And the Apostle Paul did this. He connected this going to a new life and living in a new land to our experience of baptism. Verse 23. When the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all the Pharaoh's horses and his chariots and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea, at the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty, so that the Egyptians said, I don't know if said is probably strong enough. The Egyptians finally realized, if I were writing, I might say, and the Egyptians finally panicked. They finally get it. Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against us, the Egyptians. Now, in the middle of the sea is probably the wrong place to finally come to that realization. They finally realize that that pillar of cloud that glowed at night and the dry path that they're going through the middle of the Red Sea in is not really a normal quirk of nature after all. They finally understand that it is God, Israel's God, who's not only fighting for them, but I think they finally realize that he really is the Lord of all. This next section in our story is sort of the summation of what took place. And I'm going to invite the worship team to go ahead and start making their way up here as I follow Moses and bringing the story to a conclusion. Verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and over their horsemen. So Moses stretched out their hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not one of them even remained. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. I'm going to pause just for a second there. I don't know if you've ever been out to a seashore or you've been out to a lake and you've seen dead fish. Imagine the impact if it was a dead person. That must have been a horrible sight. When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people, Israel, feared the Lord. And they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. See, not only was Egypt learning, but so was Israel. The Egyptians learned the hard way that God is the Lord of all, while the Israelites learned to fear and to believe in him, and I think in him alone. And those who were saved began to sing a new song if you go into the next chapter. Going back to Exodus, the 15th chapter, a new song that declared, "The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation." That's the new song that each of us are to sing whenever we pass through those waters of baptism to that new land and that new life that God gives to us. It may seem at times that God is leading you to just a dead end. All you may see are the dangers and the problems and the hopelessness of your situation. You may be crying out to God, "Why are you leading this way? Life was better before I started following you." But I want you to remember that God is not only near you, but he is leading you exactly in the direction that you need to go so that you will learn to trust him. Those times in our lives always give us the opportunity to reveal what's really in our hearts. And so we have to ask, man, when I'm following God, do these situations reveal what I really believe? Is God to me the Lord? Is he my salvation? I pray for that day that you let God deliver you from slavery to sin. I pray for that day when your enemies who are in hot pursuit get washed away. A day when you are led through those waters of baptism into that new life. A day when all the troubles are washed away. God has really provided you a way of escape from your slavery to sin. And he's provided it once and for all for you. And if you're already on the other side, you're already living in the new land, I hope that you will trust his leading. We're going to have a hymn of invitation or dedication, whatever it is. I hope that as we sing it, that you say, "Okay, God, what's my next step in following you?" Would you please stand?